They threatened the human girl. The academy faced the consequences. The first time Vexter stood in my path, he did not say a word. He just looked at me the way someone looks at a stray animal that wandered into a clean room. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and covered in the pale blue scales that marked every Cathari cadet at the Dominion Academy. His three friends stood behind him like furniture arranged to make a point. I was carrying my tray from the food line. I had been at the academy for 11 days. I was the only human girl in the entire building. I stepped around him. I sat down. I ate my food, and I felt his eyes on the back of my neck the whole time. My name is Zara Akafer. I am 19 years old, born in Birmingham, England, raised partly in Lagos, Nigeria, where my mother was stationed for 7 years, and partly on a military transport vessel that smelled like recycled air and machine oil. My father taught me how to strip a pulse relay before I was 10. My mother taught me how to read a room before I was 12. Between the two of them, they gave me everything I needed for the Dominion Academy, and I had earned every single point of my entrance score. I want to be clear about that. The Academy sat on a plateau on Verath Prime, a planet with 3 moons and air that tasted faintly of copper. The buildings were carved from pale stone that had been standing for over 300 years. Every corridor was wide enough for a Drenathi at full wingspread, every ceiling high enough for a Murren standing on all 4 of its upper limbs. The whole place was designed for species that were larger, older, and more confident than I was. But I was not there to be comfortable. I was there to learn. The Academy trained military officers from 42 different species. In 300 years of operation, it had never admitted a human until 6 years ago, and in those 6 years exactly 9 humans had earned a place inside its walls. When I arrived, there were 2 others beside me. One was a quiet young man named Oliver Graves who kept to himself and studied navigation. The other was a girl named Petra Lane, who had already made friends with half the Drenathi intake, and did not seem to need anyone else. I was somewhere in between. I was not isolated, but I was not settled either. I observed more than I spoke. I listened more than I reacted. My father always said that the first month in any new place was for watching, not performing. I watched. I saw that the Cathari controlled the social structure of the academy the way weather controls a coastline. They were the largest group by number. They were the most decorated species in Dominion military history, and they had been attending this academy for longer than some civilizations had existed. They did not think of themselves as dominant because they had worked for dominance. They thought of themselves as dominant because the idea of anything else simply had not occurred to them. Vexter was their center. He was in his 3rd year, which in academy terms meant he was close enough to graduation to feel certain about everything. He had the top simulation ranking in his intake year. He was admired. He was listened to. When he walked into a room, cadets from 5 different species shifted slightly in his direction without realizing they were doing it. I noticed him noticing me after my first simulation session. The Academy's tactical simulations were legendary. They placed you inside a fully rendered environment with incomplete information and asked you to make decisions under pressure. There was no single right answer. The score reflected not just outcomes but reasoning, adaptability, and what the instructors called cognitive composure, which was their polite way of measuring how badly you fell apart when everything went wrong at once. I had grown up running informal versions of those simulations in my mother's briefing rooms, listening to officers debate strategy, asking questions that made the junior staff uncomfortable. I did not find the simulations frightening. I found them familiar. I ranked 2nd in my intake group on the first session, 1st on the 2nd, 1st again on the 3rd. After the 3rd session, Instructor Delvin, a Drenathi with orange-tipped feathers, reviewed the scores publicly and said that the results were encouraging. She did not name me. She did not need to. Everyone in the room could read the board. Vexter looked at me, the way you look at a problem that should not exist. I kept eating my food. I kept doing my work. I kept ranking 1st. The days passed quietly. I made 2 friends. The first was Sovi, a Murin cadet from the coastal cities of Myra, compact and clever, with 4 arms and a habit of talking through problems out loud whether or not anyone was listening. The second was Rilo, a Drenathi from the northern mountains, built narrower than most of his species, gentle-voiced and extraordinarily precise in everything he did. The three of us ate together. We studied together. We argued about tactics in the common room until lights out, and it was the best part of every day. I was starting to feel like I belonged somewhere. That was when Vexter spoke to me for the first time. I was walking back from the equipment room, carrying a calibration kit for a navigation device I was repairing for Oliver, who had asked for my help. It was late. The corridor was empty. Vexter stepped out from a side passage with 2 of his group behind him, and he stood in front of me the way walls stand in front of people. He said my name. He said it the way you say a word in a foreign language that you find slightly ridiculous. He told me that the simulation rankings were calculated on a curve. He told me that the curve was designed to correct for species with certain cognitive advantages. He told me, very calmly, that my scores would be reviewed for accuracy. I held the calibration kit. I looked at him. I said nothing. He took 1 step closer. He said, and I am going to remember this exact phrasing for the rest of my life, that humans were not built for altitude, and that the Academy had a way of finding that out. He walked away. I stood in the corridor for a moment. I looked down at the calibration kit in my hands. Then I walked back to my room, set the kit on my desk, and opened my personal log. I wrote down the time. I wrote down the location. I wrote down every word he had said. Then I wrote down the names of the 2 cadets who had been standing behind him. I did not file a report. I did not tell Sovi or Rilo. I did not contact my parents. I just saved the log entry, encrypted it, and went to sleep. My father used to say that the first move in any conflict is not the most important move. The most important move is the one you make after you understand what kind of conflict you are in. I was still learning what kind of conflict this was. I thought about Vexter's words for a long time that night. Not the threat itself, but the shape of it, the way it was designed. He had not threatened anything specific. He had used vague language on purpose, the kind that could be dismissed as competitive banter if someone repeated it to an authority. He had brought witnesses who were loyal to him. He had chosen a corridor with no ambient recording coverage, which told me he knew exactly where those systems were and was careful about them. That was not the behavior of someone acting on impulse. That was the behavior of someone who had done this before and knew how to do it without leaving obvious marks. That understanding changed how I thought about the problem. I was not dealing with a bully who acted carelessly. I was dealing with someone who was structured and deliberate, and who understood the rules well enough to operate right at their edge without crossing into territory that could be proven. That meant I had to be more structured and more deliberate than he was. So I began to document. I wrote down times and locations. I wrote down exact words whenever I could remember them precisely, and when I could not be certain, I wrote down what I remembered and marked it clearly as approximate. I noted who was present at each interaction. I noted what the lighting conditions were, what the ambient recording coverage was, whether anyone else might have heard or seen anything. I did this quietly. I did not tell Sovi or Rilo. I trusted them completely, but I understood that the fewer people who knew I was documenting, the less chance that knowledge would reach Vexter and change his behavior before I had enough recorded to mean something. This was, I realized later, an instinct I had absorbed without knowing it from years of watching my mother operate. She always said that intelligence gathering was not about finding one decisive piece of evidence. It was about building a picture that was too complete to argue with. I was building a picture. I also began to vary my routes. I noted which corridors Vexter and his group used regularly, and which times they were likely to be in them, and I adjusted my movement through the academy accordingly. Not out of fear, but out of practicality. I could not document incidents I did not survive intact, And while I did not think Vexter would do anything physically direct in an environment this monitored, I saw no reason to make things easy for him. Oliver noticed that I had changed my corridors and asked me about it quietly one evening. I gave him a partial answer. I told him I was being careful. He nodded slowly and did not push for more, which I appreciated. In those early weeks, the thing that kept me steady was this. I had been in difficult environments before. Not like this one, not in this specific form, but I understood the basic geography of being the person who was not supposed to be somewhere. I had felt it in small ways since childhood, in rooms where people looked at me, and then looked at my mother and recalculated something behind their eyes. I had learned not to show those recalculations that they had landed. Not because I was pretending they were not happening, but because my reaction was mine to own, and I refused to give anyone the satisfaction of watching it. That discipline was useful now, in ways I had not fully anticipated when I was younger. But I was paying very close attention. 3 weeks after Vexter stopped me in the corridor, my simulation results disappeared. Not all of them, just the records from sessions 4 through 7, which were the 4 sessions where I had not simply ranked first but had scored in ranges that the instructors were beginning to describe in careful, measured language as exceptional. Those 4 sessions were gone from the official record system. In their place were entries that showed me scoring in the middle of the intake group. Average, forgettable, unremarkable. I discovered this on a Thursday morning when the weekly rankings were posted in the main hall, and I was not on them. I stood in front of the board for a moment. Sophie was beside me. She made a sound that her species made when something was deeply wrong, but she did not yet have the words for it. I said, "That's interesting." She stared at me. She said, "Zara, your scores are wrong." I said, "Yes." She said, "You should go to the review board right now." I said, "I'm going to have breakfast first." She stared at me for a long time after that. Here is what nobody understood about me in those early weeks, and what I think is true of most humans even if they do not articulate it clearly. I was not calm because I was not upset. I was calm because I had already decided what to do, and deciding what to do has always made me feel steadier than anything else. The anger was there. It was real and it was cold, and it sat behind my eyes like a headache that would not come and would not go. But I did not need to perform the anger to feel it, and performing it would not help me. I ate breakfast. I went to class. In the afternoon, I visited the Academy's technical support office and asked a very specific question about how simulation data was stored and what kind of access was required to modify official session records. The technician, a small gray-scaled Cathari named Ori who seemed to genuinely enjoy her work, explained the system to me in careful detail. She had no idea why I was asking. I thanked her and left. That evening, I accessed the backup logs from the simulation servers, which existed on a separate partition that the review system did not automatically sync to. The backup logs had not been modified. My original scores were there, intact, with timestamps, session identifiers, and the biometric verification codes that confirmed the scores were mine. I copied everything. I encrypted the copy. I stored it in 3 separate locations. Then I filed a formal discrepancy report with the Academy's review board. The review board met 4 days later. It was composed of 7 senior staff members, and 5 of them were Cathari. The commandant, Raxal, was a large and distinguished officer who had served in the Dominion fleet for 40 years before taking the Academy position. He was not unkind. He was the kind of person who believed deeply in fairness as a general principle, but became uncomfortable when fairness required him to inconvenience someone powerful. He listened to my report. He reviewed the documents I submitted. He said that data discrepancies in the simulation system were not uncommon, and that the records had likely been corrupted during a routine update, and that the system would be reviewed. He did not ask who had access to the official records. He did not ask how a routine update had affected only my sessions and no one else's. He did not look at the names I had included in my supporting documents, which were the names of Vexter and 2 of his group, both of whom had server access through their advanced systems maintenance elective. He told me that the academy appreciated my patience and that these things took time to resolve. I thanked him, I left. I added the meeting transcript to my encrypted log. I went back to class and ranked first in the next simulation session. The second incident happened 16 days after that. We had a high-altitude training exercise, which the academy ran twice a semester to prepare cadets for low-pressure environments. It involved climbing to an observation platform 3 kilometers above the academy's main level, wearing standard-issue environment suits to manage the pressure and temperature differential. It was not a dangerous exercise. The suits were rated far beyond what the conditions required. Every cadet ran a basic systems check before departure. I ran mine. I ran it because my father told me, years ago when I was small and asking questions about everything, that a suit check before a high-altitude environment was not a protocol. It was a promise you made to yourself. My suit had a fault in the pressure regulation seal. It was small, carefully placed, and would not have been visible during a casual inspection. It was the kind of fault that would have allowed the seal to hold at standard altitude but would have failed gradually above 2 kilometers, causing a slow but serious pressure drop. I reported the fault to the equipment room. The technician looked at the seal, looked at me, and said nothing for a long time. He gave me a replacement suit. He filed the fault report himself without me asking him to. I completed the exercise. I said nothing to Vexter. I said nothing to the review board. I added the fault report, the technician's filing record, and the original equipment sign-out log to my encrypted file. The sign-out log showed which cadets had accessed the equipment room in the 48 hours before the exercise. Vexter's name was in it. So were 2 others. Sophie found out about the suit fault 3 days later, through the technician, who told her because he was frightened and did not know who else to speak to. She came to my room and sat on the edge of my desk and looked at me with an expression I had not seen on a Murrin face before. She said, "You already know." I said yes. She said, "Zara, this is not just harassment. This could have been serious." I said, "I know." She said, "So why are you still sitting here?" I told her what my father told me. I told her the first move is not the most important one. I told her I was still collecting rope. She did not understand the expression. I explained it. She sat with it for a moment. Then she said, "How much rope do you need?" I said, "A little more." The rumors started the following week. I was not sure exactly how they spread, only that within 4 days, a significant portion of the academy population had heard that my entrance scores were falsified, that a human administrator had inflated my results to meet a species diversity requirement, that I had never legitimately earned my place in the intake group. I heard these things in corridors, in the dining hall, in the quiet before simulation sessions when cadets thought I could not hear them. I heard Cathari cadets say it with confidence. I heard cadets from other species say it with uncertainty, as though they were not sure whether to believe it but were not sure enough to push back. I heard Oliver Graves defend me once in the common room, loudly and with precise factual detail, which I thought was one of the bravest things I had seen at the academy. He came to find me afterward and asked if I was doing all right. I told him I was. He said, "You're going to do something about this, aren't you?" I said yes. He looked relieved. He said, "Good, because I am running out of arguments and I think Vexter's people are starting to get annoyed at me." I told him to stop engaging with them. I told him his instinct was right, but the timing was not yet right for arguments. He nodded and went back to his navigation modules. I went back to my desk. I reviewed my file. The documentation was thorough. The timestamps were clear. The chain of access logs, the simulation backup records, the equipment fault report, the corridor incident, the public ranking board, the review board transcript. Everything was there. Everything was verified. Everything pointed in one direction with the kind of clarity that did not require interpretation. And then, on a Wednesday evening in the dining hall, With 200 cadets eating and talking and living their lives, Vexter walked to my table and told me to withdraw from the academy. He did not whisper it. He said it at a volume that silenced the tables nearest to us, and then the tables beyond those, and then the room. He said that if I did not submit a voluntary withdrawal request by the end of the week, I would not make it to graduation. He said it clearly. He said it with the total confidence of someone who had never been held accountable for anything he had ever done. The room was quiet. I looked at him. I did not stand up. I held my fork. I looked at him for a long moment and then I said very calmly, "Thank you." He blinked. That was not what he was expecting. I said, "Thank you for saying that here." He left. The room stayed quiet for another few seconds. Then the noise came back slowly, the way water comes back over a stone. Sophie looked at me across the table. She said nothing. Rillo set down his drink very carefully. I finished my food. I took my tray to the return counter. I walked back to my room, opened my log, and added the final entry. Time, location, exact words, number of cadets present. The fact that the room's ambient recording system, which ran continuously in all common areas for safety purposes, had captured everything. I had my rope. I sat at my desk. I looked at the wall for a moment. I thought about my mother, who was at that moment somewhere in the outer territories commanding a fleet of 12 vessels. I thought about my father, who was probably drinking tea at his desk in the consulting office he kept in the house in Birmingham, reading security briefs and arguing with his colleagues over the communications channel. I thought about every room they had ever told me I could walk into. Then I opened my personal communications channel, and I sent a message to my mother. I kept it short. I told her I was well. I told her I had been having some difficulty at the academy. I told her I had documentation. I asked if she had a few minutes to speak. Her reply came in 40 seconds. It said, "Calling now." We spoke for 22 minutes. I told her everything. I sent her the file. She listened without interrupting, which was something she had learned to do in 40 years of command, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are you safe right now?" I said yes. She said, "Are you sure?" I said yes. She said, "All right." And the way she said it was not a relieved all right. It was the kind of all right that closes one chapter and opens another one entirely. I also forwarded the full documentation to my father, along with a short message telling him I was fine and that I thought he would find the file interesting. He replied 11 minutes later with 3 words: received, understood, proud. I went asleep. I slept better than I had since arriving at the academy. I am not sure I can fully explain why, except to say that there is a kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying something alone, and I had been carrying this alone for a long time, and now I was not carrying it alone anymore. My mother was not a woman who made noise when she acted. She had spent 40 years learning how to move quietly and arrive completely. I did not know, when I went to sleep that night, exactly what she would do or how fast she would do it. I only knew that I had told the right person, and that the right person would know what came next. The next morning I went to breakfast. I sat with Sophie and Rillo. The dining hall looked exactly as it always had. Vexter sat across the room with his group, confident and loud, entirely unaware that something had already changed. I drank my coffee. I looked out the wide windows at the 3 moons of Vareth Prime, which were all visible at once in the early morning sky. I thought the rope is out. The transmission went out at 2300 hours, Academy time. I kept it short. I kept it precise. I did not use emotional language, and I did not need to. The documentation I attached was 53 pages long and spoke with the kind of clarity that emotional language would only have diluted. Every incident was recorded. Every access log was verified. Every timestamp was confirmed against the Academy's own server records. I sent it to my mother, Admiral Adiz Akafer, commanding officer of the 7th Human Expeditionary Fleet, currently operating from the fleet carrier designation HES Callaway in the Outer Territories. I did not tell anyone I had sent it. I went to sleep at midnight. By the time I woke up the next morning, the transmission had already done things I had not planned for and could not have fully predicted, because that is what happens when you give the right information to the right people. It does not just move, it multiplies. My mother read the file at 0100 hours. She forwarded it to Fleet Admiral Colin Marsh at 0115 with a brief and precise cover note. Fleet Admiral Marsh forwarded it to the Human Diplomatic Coordination Office at 0145. The officer on duty at the Coordination Office, whose name was Nina Hartley, and who had been working overnight because the Outer Territories ran on a different time cycle, flagged the file immediately as a Priority 2 incident under the Varath Accord Species Welfare Addendum. I did not know any of this while I was sleeping. The Varath Accords were the treaty that governed humanity's relationship with the Dominion. They were signed 11 years ago after 3 years of difficult negotiation. They were, as my mother once described them to me when I was 16, the most carefully worded document that humans had ever produced, which was saying something given that humans had been producing carefully worded documents for several thousand years. Every clause, every addendum, every footnote had been argued over by people who understood that the wrong word in a treaty could mean the difference between a functional alliance and a disaster. The Species Welfare Addendum was one of the sections that had caused the most debate. It stated that any member species of the Dominion Academy had the right to expect equal treatment, documented recourse, and physical safety from any member of the Academy institution. Any verified breach of this addendum was not a matter for the Academy's internal review board. It was a matter for the Dominion High Council. By 6 in the morning, the Human Diplomatic Coordination Office had prepared a formal diplomatic inquiry. Not a complaint, not an accusation, an inquiry. There is a difference that I will explain. A complaint asks someone to fix a problem. An inquiry asks someone to explain how the problem was allowed to exist. A complaint can be dismissed. An inquiry, when it arrives from 6 separate embassies simultaneously and references a binding treaty that your civilization signed, cannot. The inquiry was delivered to the Dominion Academy's administrative office, to the Dominion High Council, to the Cathari ambassador on Varath Prime, and to 3 separate Dominion legal offices, all at the same time, at 0700 hours Academy time. I was eating breakfast when this happened. I did not know it was happening. I found out from Rillo, who came into the dining hall at 0745 moving faster than I had ever seen a Drenathi move, which is saying something because the Drenathi are built for speed when they choose to use it. He sat down across from me and said, "Zara, there are 3 human diplomatic vessels in orbit." I looked at my food. I said, "What kind?" He said, "One is a courier, one is a legal transport, one is a communication relay ship." I looked up. I said, "Only 3. He stared at me. He said, "Is that all you have to say?" I said, "I expected it might take a little longer." Sovi arrived 30 seconds later from the other direction and said nothing at all, just sat down and looked at me with an expression that I think translated roughly to, "I need you to explain every decision you have made in the last 3 weeks." I told them about my mother. Sovi said, "Your mother is an admiral." I said, "Yes." She said, "You sent the file to your mother." I said, "Yes." She said, "Not to the Dominion Legal Office, not to the Species Welfare Council, not to the Inter-Academy Oversight Committee." I said they would have taken weeks. My mother took 8 hours. Sovi sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "I want to meet your mother." I told her that could probably be arranged. Across the dining hall, I could see Vexter. He had stopped eating. 2 of his group were leaning toward him and speaking quietly, and he was very still in the way that people go still when something has changed and they are trying to figure out what it was. He had not seen me yet. I looked away before he did. Here is what was happening at the academy level. which I was only able to piece together fully afterward from the various accounts and records that became available. Commandant Raxall received the diplomatic inquiry at 0700 hours. His assistant told me later, when things had settled enough for people to speak freely, that the commandant read it 3 times. The first time, he read it as a document. The second time, he read it as a political problem. The third time, he read it as a catastrophe. Because the inquiry was not simply asking about Vexter's conduct. It was asking about the review board meeting. It was asking about the suit fault and when it had been reported and what action had been taken. It was asking about the simulation record discrepancy and the server access logs, and why the internal review board had not examined those logs when they were presented with evidence that pointed directly to them. The inquiry was asking, in the careful and neutral language that diplomatic documents use when they want to be devastating without being dramatic, whether the Academy's internal processes had failed a cadet who had a legal right to protection, and whether that failure had been institutional or individual. That question, asked by 6 human embassies simultaneously to the Dominion High Council, was not a question that could be quietly managed. It was a question that required answers, and the answers, whatever they were, would become part of the formal record of the Dominion Academy's 300-year history. By midday, 3 members of the Dominion High Council had requested briefings. One of them was Councillor Pev, who represented the Murrin people and who happened to have a trade renegotiation with the Human Diplomatic Authority scheduled for the following month. One was Councillor Drev, a Drenathi who had personally advocated for expanded human enrollment at the Academy 4 years ago. And one was Councillor Vash, who was Kethari, and who was already receiving calls from the Kethari Diplomatic Corps about managing the situation. Vexter did not attend the afternoon simulation session. I ranked first. The Academy staff watched me in a different way that afternoon, not with dismissal, not with the polite, careful look they had been using since I filed my first report. They watched me the way you watch something you have underestimated. A few of the cadets from other species nodded to me in the corridor. A Drenathi third year named Ilvin, who I had spoken to only twice before, stopped me outside the equipment room and said simply, "Good," and then walked away. I did not fully understand what was happening yet. I understood the shape of it. I understood that my mother had done something significant and that significant things had followed. But I had been carrying this quietly for so long that the scale of the response still felt distant, like watching a weather system from inside a room. Then my personal communicator buzzed, and I looked at the message, and I understood. It was from my father. It read, "Your documentation was reviewed this morning by the Human Diplomatic Authority legal team. They describe it as thorough, precise, and extremely useful. I told them you learned from the best. Your mother says she will call tonight. Also, there are now 2 fleet vessels running exercises in the Verath system. Scheduled. Nothing unusual, just scheduled." I read the message twice. Then I sat down on a bench in the corridor and I looked at the ceiling for a moment. Humans have a word for what was happening. We call it leverage, not force. Leverage. The difference between the two is that force requires you to push. Leverage means you have already positioned yourself correctly and the weight of the situation does the work for you. My mother had not threatened anyone. She had not demanded anything. She had given the right information to the right institutions through the right channels. And those institutions had responded the way institutions respond. When a treaty they signed is placed in front of them, alongside documentation that makes denial impossible. Nobody had raised their voice. Nobody had made a scene. 3 diplomatic vessels were in orbit and 2 fleet ships were running exercises nearby, and 6 embassies had sent simultaneous inquiries, and all of it had been set in motion by a 22-minute phone call and a 53-page file. That evening I spoke to my mother on a secure channel. She asked how I was doing. I told her I was fine, genuinely fine, better than I had been in weeks. She told me that the legal process would move quickly now, and that I did not need to do anything except continue attending my classes and continue being exactly who I was. I asked her if she had planned any of this. She said, "I plan to help you. The rest of it was just the system working the way it's supposed to work when someone finally holds it to account." I thought about that for a long time after the call ended. The system working the way it was supposed to work. That was what all those carefully worded treaty clauses were for. That was what the Verath Accords, with all their argued-over language and their footnotes and their addenda, were designed to do. Not to prevent conflict, but to give conflict a proper arena, a proper record, and a proper outcome. Vexter had spent 3 weeks using informal power. Social pressure, access codes, rumors, physical sabotage, public threats. He had used everything available to someone who was confident that the formal systems would either ignore the problem or manage it quietly. He had not considered what happened when the formal systems were activated properly, by people who understood them completely. I slept well again. Outside, 3 moons hung in the Verath sky, and somewhere above them in the dark between stars, 2 human fleet vessels completed their scheduled exercises and held their position. Just in case. I want to explain something about that phrase, just in case, because I think it is often misunderstood by species who did not grow up the way humans grew up. The 2 fleet vessels were not a threat. My mother had not ordered them into the Verath system to intimidate anyone or to demonstrate force. They were there because when a member of your family is in a situation that has not been fully resolved, you put resources nearby. Not to use them, simply to have them available. That distinction matters enormously to humans and is sometimes invisible to other species, which creates misunderstandings that can escalate unnecessarily. My mother had explained this to me once, years ago, when I had asked why she sometimes stationed a vessel near a region that seemed calm. She said, "You do not position strength because you expect to use it. You position strength because its presence changes what the other side believes about their options, and that change is often enough to prevent the thing you were afraid of." The Cathari, as I understood them, positioned strength as a declaration, as a statement that they were the dominant force in a space and that everyone else should adjust accordingly. That was not wrong exactly, but it was a different logic. For the Cathari, visible power was the point. For my mother, visible power was the least preferred option. The preferred option was always the quiet resolution that came from being so clearly capable that the other side chose not to find out. 2 fleet vessels running scheduled exercises in a nearby system was the quiet resolution. Vexter did not see it that way. I know this because he came to find me the day after the ships were announced in the Academy's security briefing, which was a routine notification to all senior staff and available to cadets in summary form. He did not approach me directly. He stood across the dining hall and watched me with an expression that I recognized as the first time he had been genuinely uncertain about something. He was trying to work out if I had planned this. The answer was no, but I did not correct him, let him work with the version where I had. I ate my breakfast and pretended not to notice him watching, which was its own kind of answer. That day I received a second message from my father. It was longer than the first. He told me that the Human Diplomatic Authority had formally retained 2 treaty lawyers to review the documentation in preparation for whatever legal proceedings emerged from the inquiry. He told me that Nina Hartley, the overnight officer who had first flagged the file, had apparently gone directly to her supervisor at 6 in the morning and said that if this file sat on a desk for more than 48 hours, she would be submitting her own formal complaint about the handling process. He said, "That is the kind of person the diplomatic corps produces when it is working correctly." He said your documentation made her job easy. She had everything she needed to act. She acted. I sat with that for a while. There is a particular feeling that comes when you understand that the work you did quietly, alone, without knowing if it would matter, turned out to be exactly what someone else needed at exactly the right moment. It is not the same feeling as pride. It is closer to relief. The relief of finding out that the careful thing was also the useful thing, and that the useful thing actually worked. I had not been sure it would work. I want to be honest about that. I had been careful and I had been thorough and I had trusted the process, but there is always a space between doing everything correctly and knowing that doing everything correctly will be enough. I had lived in that space for 3 weeks. It was not a comfortable space. That evening I sat at my desk and opened my personal log, not to add to the documentation but simply to write. I wrote about the year so far. I wrote about what I had expected when I arrived and what had actually happened. I wrote about Sophie and Rillo and Oliver. I wrote about instructor Delvin, who had continued to score my simulation sessions fairly throughout everything, and who I was fairly certain had submitted her own records to the Academy administration when the discrepancy became known, without saying anything to me about it. I wrote about the Academy itself, about the 300-year-old stone corridors and the wide ceilings, and the way the plateau caught the wind in the afternoons, so that there was always a sound like the building was breathing. I wrote about the copper-tasting air and the 3 moons, and the strange particular beauty of being somewhere completely unfamiliar. I wrote, I am glad I came here. Even with all of this, I am glad I came. Then I closed the log, went to the common room, and argued tactics with Sophie and Rillo until midnight. It was the best evening of the whole year up to that point. The diplomatic inquiry was formally acknowledged by the Academy's legal office the following morning. A response was required within 72 hours. The clock had started. Vexter was placed under a formal hold before noon. On the 4th morning after the diplomatic inquiry arrived, Commandant Raxall called a full staff assembly. Every instructor, every department head, every administrative officer in the Academy gathered in the main hall. I was not invited. Cadets were not invited, but the Academy's ambient recording system ran continuously in all common areas, as I have mentioned, and the main hall was a common area. I listened to the recording that evening in my room, with Sophie sitting cross-legged on the floor and Rillo standing by the window. Raxall spoke for 40 minutes. He spoke in the measured, careful tone of a man who had realized that every word he said was now being reviewed by people who were not in the room. He said that a formal investigation had been opened by the Dominion High Council's Species Integrity Office. He said that the investigation would examine the review board meeting, the simulation data discrepancy, and the equipment room incident. He said that full cooperation was expected from every member of the Academy staff. He did not mention Vexter by name. He did not need to. Vexter had been placed under a formal hold 2 days earlier, which meant he was restricted to his quarters except for classes and meals, and was barred from all Academy systems access pending the investigation. His 3 primary associates had received the same hold. Sophie listened to the recording with her 4 arms folded, which was a Murrin posture I had learned meant concentrated thought. When it ended, she said, "He sounds frightened." I said, "He is." Rillo said, "Is that fair? He dismissed your report, but I do not think he knew about the suit." I said, "Maybe not, but he knew about the simulation records, and he chose not to look at the access logs. He made a decision to not find out the truth, because finding out would have been inconvenient." Rillo was quiet for a moment. He said, "So the investigation is not just about Vexter?" I said no. It was not. The Species Integrity Office sent 3 investigators to the Academy. They arrived on the 5th day, traveling on the same courier vessel that had delivered the initial diplomatic response. They were a Drenathi, a Murrin, and a human. The human was a woman named Patricia Cole, and she was approximately 60 years old, with short gray hair and an expression that suggested she had sat across from evasive institutions many times before and found the experience more interesting than frustrating. I met with her on the 6th day in a small conference room on the Academy's administrative level. She already had my file. She had clearly read it thoroughly. She asked me questions for 90 minutes, not about the incidents because those were documented, but about the pattern, about what happened in what order, about what was said and when and by whom. She was very precise. She reminded me of my father. At the end of the meeting, she thanked me and said that my documentation was one of the most complete incident records she had reviewed in 15 years of investigation work. She said it without warmth or coldness, simply as a professional observation. I thanked her. I stood to leave. I stopped at the door. I turned and I said, "Can I ask what happens to Raxol?" She said, "That depends on what the review board records show about his decision-making process." I said, "And if the records show he knew more than he acted on?" She looked at me steadily. She said, "Then the investigation will reflect that accurately." I nodded. I left. The formal investigation hearings began on the 8th day. I was called to testify on the 9th. I sat in a chair in front of the 3 investigators and a panel of 4 Dominion High Council representatives, and I spoke for 3 hours. I answered every question directly. I did not add emotion and I did not remove detail. I simply told them what happened in order, with the documentation to support each point. Vexter testified on the 11th day. I was not present for his testimony, but Oliver Graves was in the corridor when Vexter left the hearing room, and Oliver told me that Vexter had looked, for the first time since Oliver had known him, like someone who did not know what to do with his hands. The 3 cadets who had been in the corridor the night of the first threat, who had witnessed it and said nothing, were called to testify on the 12th day. All 3 of them told the truth. On the 14th day, a Cathari cadet named Rax, who was in his 2nd year and who had never spoken to me directly, knocked on my door in the evening. He was awkward in the way that people are awkward when they want to say something they have been avoiding. He told me that he had witnessed the suit incident, that he had seen one of Vexter's group near the equipment room the night before the exercise, and that he had not said anything because he had been afraid of what would happen if he did. He said I should have said something earlier. "I am sorry." I looked at him for a moment. I said, "Go tell the investigators." He nodded. He went. My father arrived on the 15th day. He came in his official capacity as a consultant to the Human Interstellar Affairs Office, which gave him legitimate reason to be on Academy grounds during an active investigation involving a human cadet. He was 53 years old and compact in the way of men who have spent their lives in physical work, with quiet eyes and the habit of standing very still in new rooms while he worked out exactly where everything was. The Academy staff were, I was told by Sovi, who observed several of these interactions, distinctly unsettled by him, not because he said anything concerning. He was entirely polite. He introduced himself properly, shook hands with everyone, asked sensible questions about the investigation timetable, and thanked people for their cooperation. He smiled frequently. The staff found the smiling particularly unsettling. Sovi asked me about it. I explained that my father had a particular quality that I had noticed all my life. He never used his manner to threaten people. He simply made them aware, through presence alone, that he understood everything that was happening in the room and had already thought about it more carefully than they had. The smiling was genuine. He was actually pleased to be there. He found the whole situation professionally interesting. That was, for some reason, more alarming to people than anger would have been. He had dinner with me on his first night. We sat in the small cafeteria that the Academy reserved for staff and official visitors, and he ordered something that looked like it might be related to soup and asked me how I was doing. I told him I was well. He said, "You documented everything correctly." I said, "You taught me to." He said, "I taught you to check your suit seal. You taught yourself everything else." I did not have a response to that. I ate my food. He said, "Your mother is proud. So am I, and I want you to know that both of those things are true completely independently of what you did. You understand?" I said yes. He said, "Good. Now tell me what you think the outcome is going to be." I told him what I thought. I told him Vexter would be expelled because the documentation made any other outcome impossible. I told him the review board process would be restructured, because the High Council could not allow the existing process to remain in place after a formal investigation that showed its failure. I told him Raxall would probably receive an administrative reprimand, but not removal unless the investigation found evidence that he had actively obstructed rather than simply failed to act. My father listened. He said, "The reprimand will be enough, career-ending in practice if not in title." I said I thought that was likely. He said, "And the cadet experience for non-Cathari species going forward." I said they will change the review board composition, require a minimum of 3 species on any panel, add an external oversight channel so cadets can escalate outside the internal system. He said that's what the inquiry letter requested. I said yes. He looked at me over his soup. He said, "You knew that would be in the letter before your mother sent it." I said I hoped it would be. I knew what the Vereth addendum allowed for. He set down his spoon. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When did you become smarter than me?" I said, "I've always been smarter than you." He laughed. It was the best sound I had heard in weeks. The formal rulings came on the 20th day. Vexter was expelled from the Dominion Academy with a permanent notation on his service record. His 3 primary associates received formal disciplinary holds and were required to retake their current year. Commandant Raxall was placed on indefinite administrative leave pending a secondary review of his conduct during the original discrepancy report. The review board was restructured. A minimum of 3 species would be required on any disciplinary or discrepancy panel. An external oversight channel was established, allowing cadets to report to the Dominion Species Welfare Office directly, bypassing the Academy's internal system entirely. The ruling was read aloud in the main assembly hall to all cadets and staff. I sat in the 3rd row. Oliver was on my left. Sovey was on my right. Rilot was directly behind me. I listened to the ruling from beginning to end without moving. When it was finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Sovey leaned over and said quietly, "How does it feel?" I thought about it honestly. I said, "It feels like the right outcome." She said, "That's all." I said, "I'm also a little tired." She laughed. It was soft and quick, and a few cadets near us turned to look, and I did not mind at all. Across the room, I saw Rax, the cadet who had come to my door. He was watching the front of the room with an expression I recognized, because I had worn it myself at the beginning of all this. The expression of someone trying to understand where the line was between what they had believed about their world and what they now knew to be true. He had told the truth when it counted. That was not nothing. After the assembly, in the corridor outside, 3 Murrin cadets I had never spoken to came and introduced themselves. 2 Drenathi 3rd years thanked me without specifying what they were thanking me for, which I understood perfectly. A cadet from a species I was still learning, tall and bronze-colored with 4-fingered hands, said something in its own language that the translation module told me meant roughly, "You did the correct thing." I thanked each of them. Then I went back to my room, sat at my desk, and opened my encrypted log. I added a final entry: date, time, ruling summary, outcome. Then I closed the file, locked it, and set it aside. I need to tell you about what happened with the staff before I move forward, because it is part of the story and it matters. 3 instructors were found to have received information about the simulation data discrepancy before I filed my formal report and to have taken no action. They had known something was wrong with the records and had chosen to interpret it as a technical fault rather than examine it further, because examining it further would have required them to confront a Cathari 3rd year with connections to powerful families, and that was a confrontation they preferred not to initiate. They were not disciplined formally, but they were required to complete a mandatory training course on species welfare obligations, and their performance reviews for the year noted the failure of judgment. In the academy system, a performance review notation of that kind followed a staff member for the remainder of their career at the institution. It was not a loud consequence. It was a permanent, quiet one. My father said when I told him about this, that is exactly how it should work. Loud consequences invite argument. Quiet permanent consequences invite reflection. I thought about that for a long time. Patricia Cole sent me a brief message 3 weeks after the ruling, which surprised me because I had not expected to hear from her again. She said that the documentation model I had used, the structured logging with encrypted backups and cross-referenced access records, was being studied by her office as a potential template for the standard guidance given to cadets at Dominion institutions on how to document welfare incidents. She said that if I was willing to have my model anonymized and adapted for that purpose, she would appreciate my permission. I wrote back and said yes immediately. I also wrote back and said that I hoped the guidance would make it clear that the documentation was only useful because formal systems existed to receive it. The cadets who documented carefully needed somewhere to send what they had found, and that somewhere needed to be staffed by people like Nina Hartley who acted on what they received. She replied, noted and agreed. The external oversight channel, the one that allowed cadets to report directly to the Dominion Species Welfare Office, was active within 6 weeks of the ruling. The first cadet to use it was not at the Dominion Academy but at a smaller military training institution in the Murren home system, and the issue they reported was completely unrelated to anything that had happened at our academy. But the channel existed. It worked. Someone used it. That was enough. Oliver came to find me 2 days before graduation to tell me he had accepted a navigation post with the Outer Territories Survey Division, which was not a military fleet command, but was widely considered one of the most interesting and demanding navigation assignments available to a new graduate. He was quiet and pleased about it in the way that Oliver was quiet and pleased about most things, which was to say he looked like he was trying not to smile too broadly and not quite succeeding. He said, I wanted to tell you before the ceremony. I said, I'm glad you did. That assignment suits you perfectly. He said, I thought so too. Then he said, I never said this directly, so I am saying it now. What you did this year mattered to me, not just the outcome, the way you did it, the patience of it. I said, you defended me in the common room before you knew what I was planning. He said, that was just the obvious right thing to do. I said, the obvious right thing is harder than it sounds. He looked at me for a moment. He said, yes, I suppose it is. We shook hands. It was a very human gesture in the middle of an alien world, and I appreciated it more than I would have expected. Rax came to my room on the final evening before graduation. He knocked very quietly, which was typical of him. He had been doing that all year, coming quietly, checking whether he was welcome before he arrived fully, which was a habit that I suspected he had learned from somewhere difficult. He said he wanted to ask me something. I told him to ask. He said, when you were collecting the documentation, when you were building the file over all those weeks, did you ever think about stopping? About just letting it go and getting through the year as quietly as possible? I thought about that honestly. I said, yes, once around the 3rd week, not because I was afraid but because I was tired. There is a kind of tiredness that comes from carrying something alone and not knowing if it is going to matter. He said, what kept you going? I said, I thought about the next person, not abstractly, specifically. I thought about whoever was going to come to this academy after me, not knowing what they were walking into, and I thought about whether I wanted to hand them the same situation I had walked into, and the answer was no. He was quiet for a moment. He said, I thought about that too. After I came to your door, I thought about what would have happened if I had stayed quiet, what the next person would have walked into. I said, you came to the door. That is what matters. He said, you made it easier to do the right thing. Not because you made it safe, but because watching you do it quietly made me believe it was possible. I did not have an immediate response to that. It landed in a place I had not expected to be hit. I said, go get some sleep. We have a graduation tomorrow. He smiled, which I had seen him do genuinely only a few times, and left. I sat at my desk for a while after he went. I thought about the word possible. I thought about how much of what humans achieved in difficult places came down to that word. Someone watching someone else do the thing, and deciding that it was possible, and then doing it themselves, and then someone watching them, and the circle continuing forward through time in ways that could not be mapped or predicted, but were absolutely real. I thought about all the humans who had come before me into rooms where they were told they did not belong. I thought about what they had left behind for me to walk into. I thought, I hope I am leaving something useful for whoever comes next. I opened my navigation module. I had a test in 2 days, and I had not studied as much as I should have. I spent the next 3 hours learning exactly where every major Dominion transit corridor intersected with the outer territorial boundaries, and it was one of the most peaceful evenings I had spent since arriving at the academy. 6 months later, on the evening before graduation, I sat on the stone steps outside the western observation deck and watched the 3 moons of Vareth Prime rise in sequence over the plateau's edge. The first moon came up orange in the late atmosphere, the second a cold, pale white, the third trailing behind it like a thought that arrives just after you have already started speaking. I had watched this happen many times over the course of the year, and I had not grown used to it. It was the kind of sight that resisted familiarity. Sophie sat beside me. She had her 4 arms wrapped loosely around her knees, and she was watching the moons the way she watched everything that interested her, with total attention and no pretense of casualness. Rillo was inside, finalizing the calibrations on a long-range sensor array he had spent the last 3 weeks building for his engineering assessment. He had scored the top engineering marks in the Academy's combined intake. I had scored the top tactical marks. Sophie had scored the top marks in strategic communications. When the 3 of us sat down together in the dining hall for the last time, 3 different instructors had come over at separate moments to tell us something complimentary in ways that were slightly awkward, which I think meant they were genuine. It had been a strange year, strange in ways I had not anticipated, and also in ways I had. I had expected difficulty. I had expected to have to prove myself repeatedly and at a higher standard than the cadets around me, and that had been true, and it had not destroyed me because I had come prepared for it. What I had not expected was how much the academy would also give me. Not just training, though the training was extraordinary. Not just knowledge, though I had learned things this year that would take me years to fully understand. But people. Rillo and Sophie, most obviously. But also Oliver, who had finished in the top 5 of his intake for navigation, and who was already being recruited by 3 fleet commands. And Rax, who had become something I did not have an easy word for, somewhere between an ally and a student, and someone who was genuinely trying to be better. And the Drenathi instructor named Ilvin, who had said good to me in a corridor 6 months ago, and who had, over the subsequent months, become one of the most demanding and useful teachers I had ever had. She pushed her students without cruelty, which is a skill that sounds simple and is not. I had come to the academy to learn how to serve. I had learned that, and I had also learned what it meant to be part of something. Not just accepted into an institution, but genuinely part of the community that made it. That second thing was harder to earn and worth more. The first moon was fully clear of the atmosphere now, orange deepening to amber at its edges. Sophie watched it and said, "Are you nervous about tomorrow?" I said, "A little." She said, "The address." I said, "Yes." The new commandant, whose name was Drev and who was a Drenathi and who was, as I have mentioned, the first non-Cathari commandant in the Academy's 300-year history, had asked me 4 weeks ago to deliver the graduation address. I had accepted without hesitation and then spent 3 weeks trying to work out what to say. I had written 7 drafts. I had discarded 5 of them. The 6th was close. The 7th was almost right. Sophie said, "What is it about?" I said, "What humans are." She tilted her head. She said, "That's a large topic." I said, "I'm going to make it small." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "When you first told me about your mother about sending the file, I thought you had planned all of it from the beginning, every step." I said I didn't. I planned the documentation. I didn't plan what happened after. She said, I know that now. But what I did not understand then, and what I am still learning to understand, is why it worked the way it did. I have been thinking about it for months. I said, what have you decided? She turned to look at me. She said, I think it is because of what you care about. Humans do not fight for ideas. Or they do eventually, but that is not what starts it. What starts it is someone specific, someone real. You were not upset about the principles at stake. You were upset because someone tried to push you out of a place you had earned. And when your mother received your file, she was not upset about diplomatic protocols. She was upset because someone had put a faulty seal on her daughter's pressure suit. I looked at the moons. She said, that is very different from how the Cathari operate. For the Cathari, the institution is the thing. The hierarchy is the thing. They protect it because it represents something abstract and important. But humans protect people. And because you protect people, you build networks of obligation and care that run underneath every formal structure, and those networks activate in ways that formal structures cannot predict or contain. I sat with that for a while. I said, that's a very good way of saying it. She said, I have been thinking about it for 6 months. I said, it's going into the address. She said, good. The second moon was up now, pale and cold and clear. I thought about what else needed to go into the address. I thought about the things I had seen this year that had mattered. The way Rax had knocked on my door. The way Oliver had defended me in the common room before he knew what I was planning, simply because it was the right thing to do and he was that kind of person. The way Rillo had asked careful, precise questions about what I needed rather than telling me what he thought I should do. The way my father had sat across from me with his soup and asked me what I thought the outcome would be, not because he needed my analysis, but because he wanted me to hear myself think. I thought about Patricia Cole, the investigator who had said my documentation was the most complete she had reviewed in 15 years. She had said it without warmth, as a professional observation. I had appreciated that more than praise would have. I thought about Commandant Raxall, who was on administrative leave and whose career had ended in practice without ending officially. I did not feel triumphant about that. I felt sad in a quiet way, the way you feel when something could have been different and was not. He had not been a bad person. He had been a person who made a bad decision, and the decision had been bad enough to matter, and the consequences had followed. That was the correct outcome. It was still a sad one. I thought about Vexter. I had not seen him since the ruling was read in the main hall. He had left the academy the same day, and I had heard nothing about him since. I did not know what he was doing or where he had gone or what, if anything, he understood differently about what had happened. I had written him a letter once, 3 weeks after the ruling when things had settled and I had had time to think. I wrote it and read it and deleted it, not because it was wrong but because it was for me and not for him. I had needed to write it. I did not need to send it. I hoped he figured out the difference between power that was given to you and power that you earned. Those were not the same thing. He had grown up believing they were, and that belief had cost him everything he had worked for. I hoped, somewhere in the time after the academy, he worked out where the confusion had started. I hoped it for his sake. I genuinely did. The third moon cleared the atmosphere. The sky was full now. Sophie said, I am going to miss sitting here. I said, we will find other places to sit. She said, yes, but they will not have 3 moons. I said, probably not. We sat for a while without talking. The air was copper cold and very clear, and the lights of the academy glowed behind us through the thick stone windows, and below the plateau, the plains of Vereth Prime stretched out in all directions into a darkness that was not empty but full of something I did not yet have words for. In the morning, I would stand in front of every cadet and instructor at the Dominion Academy and give a speech about what humans were. I would stand there as the first human to top the combined tactical rankings in the Academy's 300-year history, which was a fact that had been stated in 3 separate official documents now, and still seemed slightly unreal when I thought about it directly. I would stand there as a cadet who had been told, in various ways and through various methods, that she did not belong here. I would stand there anyway. This is what I said the next morning, standing at the center of the main assembly hall with every seat filled, and the wide high windows letting in the flat bright light of Vareth Prime's sun. I was told once that humans don't belong here. I want to talk about that for a minute, because I think it is worth examining honestly. It is true that humans are not the oldest species in the Dominion. The Kethari have been mapping stars for longer than human civilization has existed. The Drenathi were writing philosophy before we discovered fire. The Murren had a working theory of faster-than-light travel before our ancestors were drawing on cave walls. In almost every measurable category of civilization age, humans are the newcomers in this room. It is also true that humans are not the physically strongest species. We are not the longest lived. We do not have the best natural sensors, the most efficient metabolisms, or the strongest memory recall. We are, by many objective measurements, unremarkable. I want to tell you what humans do instead. Humans remember faces. Not just faces, but the stories attached to faces. We remember who was kind to us on a difficult day. We remember who told the truth when it would have been easier not to. We remember who stood up for someone who could not stand up for themselves. And we remember the people who did not, and we carry both of those memories for a very long time. This means that when one human is threatened, the math changes. Not because of any formal agreement or diplomatic protocol, though we use those too, but because somewhere in the network of people that human knows and loves, there are other humans who remember that person, who remember their face and their story, who have decided at some point that this person matters, and who will not be argued out of that decision by anyone. The Kethari protect institutions. That is a noble impulse. Institutions endure. Institutions outlast individuals. Institutions carry the accumulated knowledge and standards of a civilization forward through time. I understand the value of that. But humans protect people. And when humans protect people, they do it with everything they have, through every channel available, using every skill and resource and relationship that connects them to the world. They do it formally when the formal systems work, and they find other ways when the formal systems fail, and they do not stop until the person is safe. This is not always convenient. I am aware of that. This year has not been convenient for many people in this room, and I want to acknowledge that honestly. But I also want to say this. The Varath Accords exist because humans and the Dominion decided to build something together that was worth the difficulty of building it. Those accords are a formal institution. They are carefully worded. They were argued over for 3 years by people who care deeply about getting the language right. And they work when they are held to properly, for exactly the reason I have been describing, because they are not just words. They are the formal expression of a set of values about what people owe each other, and they were written by humans who take that kind of obligation seriously. I came to this academy because I earned my place here. I stayed because I believed in what this academy is supposed to be. And I can tell you, honestly and without any bitterness, that this year has confirmed that belief for me, even through all its difficulty. Because at the end of this year, the academy is better than it was when I arrived. The review board is more representative. The escalation channels are clearer. The documentation trail is more transparent. Those things are good things for every cadet who comes after us, regardless of species. And they happen not because I am extraordinary, but because I did ordinary things carefully. I documented what was true, I told the people who could act on it, and I trusted that the systems we had built together were worth trusting. Someone once told me that humans do not last long at altitude. I have thought about that a great many times since then. I think what they were trying to say was that humans do not belong in difficult places, that we are not built for environments that test us. I disagree. I think humans are built for exactly those environments. I think we are at our most human when things are hard, and we choose to document carefully instead of reacting carelessly, and we call our mothers, and we trust the people who love us, and we keep going. We have been told that before, about every room we have ever walked into. We are still here. We are always still here. Thank you. The room was quiet for a moment after I finished. Not the silence of indifference, but the silence of a room that is deciding what it feels. Then it was not quiet anymore. I stood at the podium, and I let the sound wash over me, and I thought about my father drinking tea in Birmingham, and my mother somewhere above the outer territories in her fleet carrier, and Sovie and Rillo in the front row, and Oliver 3 seats over with his careful navigator's hands folded in his lap, and Rax in the middle section looking at me with the expression of someone who has decided something. I thought about all the rooms humans had ever walked into and been told they did not belong. I thought we are always still here. After the ceremony, after the graduation credentials were distributed and the photographs were taken and the dining hall was opened for the celebration meal, Commandant Drev found me near the entrance and shook my hand, which was a Drenathi gesture of formal respect that they did not offer casually. He said the address was well done. I said thank you. He said the part about institutions and people. I want to use that in the new cadet orientation, if you would permit it. I said I would be honored. He nodded. He said, you should know that your file has been reviewed by the Fleet Selection Board. You will receive the formal notification in the next week. I am telling you now so that you can celebrate tonight knowing what is coming. I looked at him. I said, which fleet command? He said, your mother's. I stood in the entrance of the dining hall with the sound of celebration behind me and the pale evening light of Vareth Prime coming through the doorway ahead, and I smiled. It was not a small smile. I am not sure I have ever smiled quite that fully. I sent my mother a message, 3 words, I will come. Her reply took 4 seconds. It said, I know, I always knew. I went into the dining hall. I sat with Sovie and Rillo and Oliver and Rax. I ate my food and I laughed at things that were genuinely funny, and I listened to stories I had not heard before, and I was completely present for all of it, every minute, because I had learned this year that presence was not something you should save for later. Later was uncertain. Now was what you had. The 3 moons of Vareth Prime rose outside the wide windows, orange and white and trailing, in their same patient sequence. I watched them for a moment through the glass. Then I turned back to my table and I was there, fully and entirely, with the people I had chosen and the life I had earned. We stayed until they turned the lights down low. We stayed past that. Humans do not leave early when something is worth staying for. We never have.